Hello, and welcome to Week Old Beans, the podcast about the news and also history. We're actually not very disciplined about our topics.
And also we also discuss beans that are a week old too in this podcast.
Sure, that's really what the listeners come back.
This is all going to culminate in a 65 episode series where at the very end I reveal that we've been each topic is me counting old beans that I keep in my refrigerator, and we're only doing that many episodes. That are
exactly
definitely what's happening. Anyway, we have actually a very serious topic to talk about. Putting aside that introduction, we're actually going to talk about something actually like real and terrifying that's happening at the southern border right now. So I'm going to let Fowler lay it out. We didn't. Did we ever introduce ourselves? We didn't.
We did not.
I'm Abbot. That's Fowler. Fucking, if you've stuck with us for 33 episodes, you should fucking know who we are by
now. Yeah, I will say that making political content is significantly easier during like the rise of fascism and all the corruption and inequality and stuff like that. Like I remember when me and Ardot were kids, like during the Democratic primary, Howard Dean made like a yippee, and that was like a week's worth of coverage.
Yeah, he made like a yippee noise. Or when Obama wore his tan suit, and like that was the thing. Like that was the discourse that people talked about. So yeah, we have a pretty serious topic to talk about. So Fowler, go ahead and just lay out what's going on.
So this is a big topic in the South, and it's nonstop within Republican media. But actually, a lot of my friends farther up north have not really been getting a lot of updates. But there's this massive constitutional crisis on the border, which I think is going to be like the defining. Well, actually, I don't want to jinx myself. I was going to say it's the defining issue of the Biden administration, but like it is February. So
yeah. There's been many. We've had many defining moments of the Biden administration. It really amped up over the past like 2 years too. Like the first 2 years of the Biden was going so well. Like nothing was happening, nobody cared, and just the past like 365 days have just been all of the worst things that could possibly happening. Like, yeah, Ukraine happened, but we made the right decision on Ukraine, and it was very, we had a, like the post 9/11 American euphoria of, like, yeah, we're fucking fighting the Russians, and, and then it just,
Well, I think the media and like politics in general were like suffering from PTSD from Donald Trump and the fact that like Joe Biden wasn't in the news every day for doing insane criminal or racist things. Like I think he was given an enormous honeymoon by like most of the powers that be.
They were just like, oh fuck, we can finally cover like normal shit. Like I don't know, what is the news cover that's like normal? I mean, now it's just like I don't know, like now it's Taylor Swift. That's the big culture war thing. It's just Taylor Swift, which is not that you shouldn't go after Taylor Swift. Like if you sent Taylor Swift to the border, the Swifties would end this problem in like 20 minutes. It's just
so what's happening is there's a huge border crisis that has basically been instigated by Greg Abbott. For those who don't know, Greg Abbott is the Republican far-right governor of Texas. A lot of the times when we talk about like Republicans on this podcast, it's mainly because they're fascists. Greg Abbott, he's not really a fascist. He's just like the most racist human being since James Vardaman. Greg Abbott really ran on and has developed a brand about the immigration problem on the border. And he has been virulently racist about it. Greg Abbott has made insane comments about the border. He's called it an invasion. He has said before publicly that like he would simply order the police and the National Guard to just execute migrants if they tried to cross the Texas border if he didn't think he would get in legal trouble. But Abbott has sort of come into the public spotlight because he has been doing a lot of inhumane things on the border to try and keep migrants out, including putting razor wire and razor boobies in the water.
Our friend Fowler is Internet's buffering. Very unfortunate. Anyway, I'll continue talking for him since he's frozen. Basically, Greg Abbott is doing very bad shit, putting up barbed wires at the border, putting up, trying to put up trying to put up like river blocks, all sorts of really, really, really not good things. Not good whatsoever. And all of this has culminated in an attempt at deploying the National Guard to sort of kind of like circumnavigate the federal government. Biden has sent border agents down to the Texas border in an attempt at assisting with the issue. And for the most part, Fowler's back. He's back.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. I went ahead and continued your sentence for you since you exploded and you disappeared into subspace. So if you want to continue, I explained to the people that Abbott has been. I explained to the people that Abbott has deployed the National Guard to counter some of the federal agents that Biden has sent to the border to, I'm assuming, assist or make Texas stop putting up barriers.
So the two things that Abbott has done that are like unconstitutional is Abbott has the Supreme Court ruled that what Abbott is doing on the border with the razor wire and the razor boobies, which has already killed at least 3 people, probably more, that's unconstitutional, and they have ordered him to basically take everything down, and he has refused, which is completely unconstitutional and basically breaks like the whole idea of like the federal government has supremacy, the supremacy clause, and the states must acquiesce to the federal government and they must obey federal laws. And the other thing Abbott has done is federal troops, federal agents, they have supremacy as well over state troops. That's the way it goes. If the federal government orders state level or local law enforcement to do things, they are legally compelled to do it. And Abbott's National Guard has refused to take orders from federal border patrol agents, which again has led to the deaths of at least 3 people. And so, this is a huge problem. The way Abbott has justified it is he claims that because the border crisis is so bad, a border crisis that he has dramatized and also made worse, that it gives him emergency powers that override essentially the federal government, but also like the courts in America. And as you could probably imagine, that's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, so it's
government, our country cannot survive if governors can simply tell the courts to go fuck themselves, or tell the federal government like, oh, the federal government passed this law. Yeah, that doesn't matter. In Texas, we do whatever the fuck we want. That's the end of law and order. That's the end of the country. And this is completely unprecedented. While there is a history of the South, particularly Texas, like fear rattling about leaving and seceding, and Southern leadership have for generations increased the power of the state and made states' rights a huge part of their platform, we've never had a governor like openly and brazenly defy the courts and the federal government in this direct a way. Of Abbott using the National Guard essentially as a private military that can't be controlled by the legislative branch or the courts.
True. So do you want to get into, and I remember you were just saying that DeSantis, Haley, and other governors have stated they will send troops to assist Abbott. So other Southern governors.
So Donald Trump and Nikki
Trump
Haley have both. Nikki Haley and Donald Trump have both endorsed Abbott and said that Abbott is correct, which completely blows Nikki Haley's argument out of the water that she is not Trumpian. But more dangerously than that, and a lot of Republican or congressmen have also backed it. But the more dangerous thing and the unprecedented thing is that out of the, I believe it's 15 Republican governors in the United States, 14 of them have backed Abbott, and 10 of the 14 have said that they're going to send assistance, perhaps their own National Guards, to the border. And Ron DeSantis, the uncharismatic dystopian governor of Florida,
Wet paper towel.
he recently
Sorry.
He recently sent 1,000 National Guards and state guards to the border to assist Abbott, and that, this could create a situation where if the other Republican governors aren't bluffing, there could be tens of thousands of National Guards and state guards sent into Texas to basically, give Abbott a military to defy the courts and to defy the federal government. So I think this is the most serious constitutional crisis, since January 6th. And on a state level, probably the greatest constitutional crisis since the Civil War.
I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. So I guess what was the second point that you wanted to get into on the podcast? Was it talking about, was it given oh no, you wanted to have a back and forth later. So we talked about DeSantis and Haley. And so now do you want to get into the meat of things?
Let's talk about Biden or let's talk about the history of this, and let's talk about then we'll talk about the Biden administration's response.
Okay.
So you can do the Biden administration's response, and I'll do the history part.
Okay.
So for people who are not from the South,
Wait, I feel like I should be talking about this part because you can go.
Okay, you can. Yeah, you
do. No, you go. I'm gonna let you do it because you'll be able to explain it more in a more linear way than I will.
So
I will correct you when you say incorrect.
After the Civil War, one of the ways that the Southern aristocrats who control the politics and business of the South, one of the ways they maintain control is after the Civil War, they created kind of this conspiracy theory that like the reason they had to hold power, the reason like the South had to be unified was because the North was always planning on reinvading them. So every time reformist movements have popped up or ethnic minorities have attempted to get their rights, the Southern leadership have basically said we can't cede to these people because the North is behind it and they're weakening the South or breaking down our traditions so that like they can retake us. And that is a fear that tens of millions of Southerners have quietly believed. And these fears have only become greater with the lies the Republican Party under Donald Trump have told. The lies that Joe Biden didn't win the last presidential election fairly. The lies that the DOJ is being weaponized against Trump and his political allies in order to like persecute them. This persecution complex and this fear of this invasion, that paranoia of anti-federalism and anti-northernism is just become a stronger presence. And so when Abbott does this, when Abbott defies the federal government, when Abbott defies the Supreme Court, he is tapping into like a primordial fear in the South that has been quietly believed by a lot of people, but he is very much giving life to it in a way that I think hasn't been the case nationally in a very long time.
True. So I'll point out I will point out two things. So I want to get into the Biden response, and then I'll give my sort of not counter, and we can open this part up for discussion, Fowler. We'll use that as the discussion point. But so first and foremost, the Biden response has been lackluster. I believe he is trying to push through a border security, border reform, whatever you want to call it, bill through Congress that's currently stalling. In large part because the Republican Party does not want there to be genuine immigration reform. I mean, the immigration system in the United States is broken. It is ineffectual. It is very shitty, in large part because the mechanisms that allow for people to move through asylum claims, through just the process in general, is underfunded. We don't have enough judges. There's not enough staffing to process everybody's claims. It's just a very, very, very sort of broken system. And many people have pointed out that is what needs to be addressed, less so than the bodies of the people trying to cross the border themselves. But Fowler, I know you're opposed to the bill that's kind of moving through Congress. But even then, I'm not sure how far Biden's going to get with that because the Republican Party is not really interested in fixing the immigration problem because for the most part, the immigration issue.
They need immigration as the
Yes,
thing to run on because they
yes,
have failed so systemically on policy.
yes. They don't
But I
really
would say
have policy.
the problem I have with the bill, I don't have a problem with border reform. My problem with his specific bill is it's draconian and it's cruel because he's ceding to a lot of the worst instincts of the Republican Party of not really fixing the problem, just making life as unpleasant and brutal and potentially deadly to immigrants fleeing for their lives. So that's the first part, which not only is amoral that he's backing it, but also like it's an election year. There are a lot of Hispanics who vote for the Democratic Party. You know, no fucking liberal is going to like this bill if it passes. You know, he's already bleeding votes because of the war. He's already bleeding votes for all the other dumb things he's done. He does not need to tie his genocide Joe nickname to, instead of just murdering Palestinian children, to also like more people dying at the border, beginning like drowning in the rivers because of the razor buoys, or getting caught on the razor wire and getting cut up. Like that's not what we need.
Yes.
The second thing is there's a difference between trying to pass legislation to fix a problem, because like reasonable Republicans within the House or Senate push legislation and meet with him. But this is all being who is basically claiming that he doesn't have to listen to federal law or any of the courts, and he can rule as essentially a dictatorial figure in Texas. And you know, responding to Greg Abbott's insane anti-democratic, you know, essentially.
I'll go ahead and finish his sentence for him. He was saying that ceding to passing this border bill and ceding to Greg Abbott essentially essentialize, or not essentializes, but it justifies Greg Abbott, what Greg Abbott is doing. Um, damn internet, can't help it, can't do nothing about it. But I finished your sentence for you, Fowler.
So on to the way the Biden administration should respond. I think the Biden administration should either, because the National Guard in times of non-emergency work for the state and they work for the governor, but ultimately they're under control of the federal government. So I think what Biden should do is he should basically federalize the state troops and basically say that they're under his control. And then if they defy him and they continue to serve under Abbott and DeSantis and the other governors, he should send federal troops down to the border. He should arrest them if they resist. And he should look, the DOJ should look into investigating Abbott and maybe other Republicans who have backed Abbott by sending soldiers, you know, for sedition.
That
And I think
is.
there's a.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was gonna. Can I
You can
add?
go.
Oh, I was gonna add to that and say that is the logical and intelligent thing that should be done. However, I think January 6th and the Democratic response to January 6th is enough to prove that they don't have the spine to do anything worthwhile. Nobody's getting arrested for defying the Constitution. Nobody is gonna. There's no troops that are gonna get sent down there. Nobody is going to be held accountable because the Democratic Party has consistently proven that they are ineffectual at defending democracy from belligerent forces and people who seek to usurp it. So I agree with you that that's what should happen, but I'm not really convinced that the Biden administration or the broader Democratic coalition has the balls to actually do anything that involves making them look quote unquote divisive or like holding accountable people who have proven that they are not willing to participate in the democratic process.
If they do this, if they don't send anyone down to the border and they allow this, they create a precedent that allows any governor who is crazy enough to, whenever they want, defy anything the court decides, including the Supreme Court, the highest court in the nation, and they allow the governor to choose which federal laws they wish to enact and which they won't. Like, it is not crazy that like under a system where this is allowed, like what's to stop another governor from being like, actually, I don't give a fuck that the federal government says segregation is legal. I don't give a fuck that, gay marriage is federally recognized. Like, I don't give a shit about any of that. I'm the governor. I'll do what I want. There's precedent for it. I don't have to do anything.
It's gonna set a very bad precedent. I'm just not very optimistic that the Biden administration or the Democrats are going to address this threat with any sense of urgency or intelligence. I think January 6th is like, for me, it's made me very cynical towards the Democratic Party, because I feel as if January 6th was the moment when there should have been people arrested. There should have been people tried immediately for sedition and treason against the United States of America, but nothing happened. They launched a very shitty and useless what was it, review panel a year and a half after the thing happened, and then they launched their investigation like 2 years after the actual event happened, when it had already been wiped from the public consciousness, and when the Republican Party had already had enough time to come up with conspiracies against the conspiracies in favor of the perpetrators.
The other part of it is, like, if you're a Southern Democrat, particularly if you're a minority Southern Democrat, there is no point in voting for Joe Biden or voting for the Democratic Party if they're not even willing to enforce the federal law. Like, what the fuck is the point of voting for Joe Biden, and pushing for progressives inside the National Congress and Senate if, they allow governors to ignore the laws that they pass, and the president doesn't enforce the laws that the National Congress and Senate do. It's a betrayal of everyone who is a Democrat, everyone who's progressive, who lives in the South, abandoning them in the same way after Reconstruction failed that President Johnson after the Civil War did, of just allowing the South to serve as this like feral, backwards authoritarian regime, and basically putting everyone who lives in those places at the mercy of the worst kind of human beings without the protection of the federal government, which they are entitled to as American citizens.
Yeah, I guess that's the second part I want to get into, because I think Fowler and I. So I live in the South, as you can probably tell. Fowler and I have had many a disagreements about what we believe to be each other's biases towards our particular regions, and I'll grant him some concessions about the negatives and positives of the South. But I will say, I think a lot of my bias and a lot of my frustrations come not just from the society that I grew up in, but more so from the frustration that Fowler just kind of laid out, where, putting aside this incident, if you go back to Reconstruction, which was post Civil War when the South was economically devastated, you had obviously the ending of slavery, which meant the ending of the main sort of economic power of the South, and nothing could replace it. And the whole point of Reconstruction was to build back up the economy of the South, industrialize the South, shift the South away from an agrarian society into one, or at the very least, reform the agrarian society that at the time was vital in the South. And of course, we all know the story. Lincoln, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, was a Southern sympathizer. Lincoln was shot in the back of the head in a movie theater, and Andrew Johnson took over as president. And Andrew Johnson, basically pardoned or gave all his Confederate buddies a free pass. And they entered.
And in a sense, the other part of Reconstruction that really matters is Reconstruction was also the federal government enforcing the rights and protections of African Americans.
Yes.
During Reconstruction, African Americans not only were able to build their own communities, create Black economies, Black Americans were able to run for and hold public office. And all of this progress was completely destroyed by President Johnson, who was impeached by the House for this. Like, African American politicians who had been elected by their constituents were forced to resign or were killed by the Ku Klux Klan. African Americans who voted or engaged in politics, they were threatened or killed by the Klan. African American businesses and economic power centers were burned down by angry whites. It was a complete disaster. And this is particularly in the time of Donald Trump, in the time of the MAGA movement, when racial politics has come back into being overt and brazen and direct policy. You can't allow particularly complete monsters like Greg Abbott, who view massive amounts of the Texas populace as basically inhuman animals. You can't allow them to be the ones to determine everything. In a world where Greg Abbott has a private army made up of the National Guard, like, who's to say that history won't repeat itself? Like, who's to say that, like, progressive Democrats in Texas are safe? Who's to say that if they pass laws they do things,
I don't mean to
Greg Abbott will respect any of that?
Let me interrupt you real quick because I feel like I can't say it on the podcast because we will get flagged for I will get flagged for hate speech if I say this word. But for any of you guys who are interested in looking up, speaking about history repeating itself, we can't get into it because we don't have time. But look up Operation. I'm gonna say the rhyme. It rhymes with Metback. Operation Metback. Under the Eisenhower administration, that was carried out in Texas and I think Texas and Arizona and other sort of border adjacent states. Operation Metback. It's not Metback, but you'll know it refers. It's a slur for a Hispanic person is the word. But basically that was when I think it was the federal and I think the federal government in line with the state government deported almost I think 2 million Hispanic Americans illegally. 2 million Hispanic Americans who were quote unquote illegal citizens, and we found out years later that many of those were actually citizens of the United States. They were not illegal residents. If you need a historical example of what Fowler and I are talking about, that actually did happen.
And for those who think, like, when Ardot and I are describing, like, realities of what could happen if this precedent is allowed to continue, like, you should look up some of the history of the post-Reconstruction South, and you should look up the history of, the operation that Ardot was talking about, or just any point in time in which federal policy has been benign neglect. Basically, we will, we will abandon the South as a project for various reasons, and we will not, like, use federal resources or law enforcement to enforce the laws down there or ensure that people are protected. Like, this is not something that is insane.
The Great Migration. That's another historical thing that should be researched by anybody that has the time. The reason for the Great Migration was not just because of economics. It was not just because Black Americans from the South wanted to go up to chilly New York and hang out in the snow. It was because they were fleeing the Ku Klux Klan and fleeing the lack of protection that was, or fleeing to go towards states that were federally protected. We're gonna, this is gonna be the cage match. So laying out, how, I was explaining, the Reconstruction and stuff like that. And going back to the border issue, right? So let me lay out the argument that Abbott makes and the argument that I've spoken to many people who I've spoken to from places like Texas, especially border towns in Texas and Arizona. The argument that Abbott is making and the argument that the sort of pro-Abbott, pro-border Republicans are making is that, hey, look at Texas, look at Arizona, look at all these states, Texas being the primary one, and Arizona, and I think Nevada as well being other ones. You go to these border communities and the situation is just out of control. You have people, they'll say things like, fentanyl crossing the border. Cocaine crossing the border, people with nefarious intentions sneaking into our country to do stuff. That's the primary argument, right? And, if you go and watch, interviews from people who have land that's on the border, they're all very frustrated. And many of them are not nefarious individuals. Many of them have much more realistic, expectations of what should be done because they're the ones who actually have to live with it. Eagle Pass, the town where this is happening, like where all this is going down, Eagle Pass, Texas, they're not fucking happy with Abbott. They're not, because they're having to live with the reality of what these policies mean, as well as the reality of what bad border policy means, which is something that not just the Republicans are responsible for, but the Democratic Party as well. Our inability to effectively pass proper border legislation under, all the way back to the Bush administration is part of the reason why this is happening. And our refusal, the neoliberals, the Joe Bidens, the Barack Obamas, their refusal to acknowledge that a big reason why there is such an influx of immigrants from South America is because of our policies towards South America, the sort of neocon, neoliberal policies of the late 1900s, where we overthrew democratically elected, you know, it overthrew democratically elected leaders in places like Guatemala, Honduras, Chile, and added or, supported, deranged fascist Pinochet, deranged fascists, so that we
We
could
did
counter
this
the
because
Soviets.
if you give South Americans democracy, as it turns out, they do not like the fact that we've completely stacked all the trade agreements to rape all of their lands, take all of their resources, and not pay them.
Yeah.
So the South Americans have this disconcerting habit of whenever they're given democracy, their leadership says that actually those resources are theirs to control, and the Americas cannot use South America as a glorified plantation.
Yes, we've exported the, it's the beautiful thing about capitalism. We've exported the acts. We've exported the attitude of slavery. We didn't actually really abolish it. We just sent it to other places and are aggressively supporting its perpetuation, so that we don't have to look at it here and that we feel good about ourselves here. But I digress. So, there, of course, because the rape of South America is a neoliberal project. Joe Biden and the Democrats are not ever going to address it. But that is what is fueling the influx of immigrants from places from South America. It's not something that's happening because they just all. I mean, many of them want to come to America and participate in the American dream, but they're coming here because they're fleeing unbelievable amounts of violence and an economic circumstance that we have helped facilitated, or that we have helped facilitate. And so there's not going to be a, addressing that, because it wouldn't just condemn the Republican Party, because the Republicans are also in favor of it, but it would also condemn the Democratic Party as well. And they're not gonna throw themselves under the bus for, for justice and peace. But I
I
don't,
will say, I think Obama was terrible on this issue. I think Biden is generally better on this issue.
yes, Biden has made more effort
He has not put more money. He has not put like a huge amount of resources or time into South America. But one of the things about Biden's policy is he does not believe in overt antagonism to Democratic leaders in South America who are anti-American. And the best example of this is the Biden administration supported former President Lula da Silva in Brazil against the fascist Bolsonaro and allowed Lula to come to power, despite the fact that Lula is very anti-American. He has described the American empire as the greatest threat to world peace, and he is a figure who is very economically protectionist and would damage the American economy economically if he was allowed to take power again.
yes.
And so, like, Biden allowing him to take power and supporting him was
step in the right direction.
Unprecedented to American foreign policy.
Absolutely. And another thing too is that I think we have a perception, obviously, of Hispanics as being this monolithic, homogeneous group, but they're not. Something that doesn't get talked about a lot when we talk about immigration is that immigration from places like Mexico has actually fallen, because Mexico has gotten more economically prosperous, in thanks to not just the sort of not just because of the Mexican government becoming less corrupt, but also because of cooperation between the Mexican government and the United States government. So the fear of the Mexican, which plagued, even Fowler and I were both, relatively young people. The fear of the Mexican, that was when we were younger, the big threat on the border. But that actually is not even the case anymore. It's mostly people from South America that are trying to cross the border now, not Mexico. So I guess that's my perspective on it. And when you as a Southerner, I mean, I do feel in a way for people who are frustrated, because I do think there is a little bit of dissonance. I think you're seeing it with the busing. I think it's I don't get any pleasure out of it, but I will say, like, it is interesting to watch New York City and Chicago and all these other sort of blue quote unquote cities with their, having to actually receive a fraction of the sort of quote unquote problem that places like Texas are having to deal with. And I do think in part that the Democratic Party's sort of refusal to, and I think this goes back in line with what Fowler and I were just talking about the idea of abandoning the South and sort of how, this was the point of contention that Fowler and I have, how I feel like it's a huge problem, or at least it's been an issue with the way the Democratic Party has kind of operated, because they've sort of, even back during the Obama years, or at least towards the end of the Obama years, um, didn't seem like the South was worth it. Because we're all dumb hicks down here. So, there's no point in trying to build coalition with people down in the South. And I think and I think everybody, you see people talk about it. Let's say the sort of liberal elitism. That's a big thing in certain spaces. People not liking the way that it feels as if what's the other thing, Fowler, they say the East Coast Club or whatever, East Coast liberals.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's all a political theater, I think, when they say that. But I do think I think there's a reason why that language struck a nerve when Trump would talk about, those types of people, despite the fact that he's one of those people. But I think there's a reason.
Billionaire.
Yeah, exactly.
He's the definition.
Yeah, he is the definition of the elite. Like, it's really funny. But I digress.
I think
even at a local level, when someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene says it to her constituents, there's a reason why it resonates. And I think it's in part because of the fear of Northern aggression. It speaks to the fear of Northern aggression, the fear that the North is going to reinvade. But then it also, I think, speaks to something that is very real, and that is the sort of failings of the Democratic Party to really attempt at, or at the very least, the failings of the Democratic Party and the failings of the media to really aggressively try to push for and support their people in the South.
Yeah, I would agree that immigration is a serious problem. I mean, I think it's like over the past year, 330,000,
and that includes and that includes addressing the people of the South. That includes addressing immigration, which, whether you like it or not, whether you're pro-immigration or not, for people living at the southern border and people living in the South, they are the ones who have to deal with it more than somebody living up in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, or whatever. That's just the reality of having a country as big as the United States. Different regions are going to have different problems that they sort of internalize and want to deal with. And I don't think it's worth saying, hey, if you're somebody that is concerned about immigration, or someone that is, that thinks of immigration as a real political issue because you feel like you live it, like the people in Eagle Pass or the people in certain Texas towns, they are living the reality of a broken immigration system. Somebody in Rhode Island or New York is not living that reality. I do think it's worthwhile to say, hey, your concerns are valid. We don't agree with the way that Republican politicians are weaponizing xenophobia, racism, and different bigotry. But we hear your concerns, and we're going to try to address those concerns. And I think that's where the link has kind of been broken. I don't know if you feel the same, Fowler.
I agree to some extent, but it has to be noted that the Republican Party is not genuinely trying to fix the border.
True, and may I say one more thing too?
The Republican Party has rejected, across the Biden administration and in the Trump administration, attempted bipartisan legislation that was going to fund the border wall and was going to, try and resolve the situation.
Absolutely. Can I say something real quick too?
The conservatives on the federal and the state level have completely cut all the agencies that are responsible for being, for basically like taking in the refugees and monitoring them and giving them like healthcare and processing them through the legal system. They want the immigration problem to continue to be a problem, and they will continue to exaggerate it and exasperate it because it gives them power.
True, absolutely.
In the same way that the Dixiecrats used Black people as a constant boogeyman to scare their constituents into line when they weren't giving them healthcare, when they weren't giving them job security, when they weren't giving them prosperity. And
I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you 100%. I will say too, I think this is something I've been thinking about because I'm pretty blunt. I make my opinions on things known. I'm not when it comes to certain left-wing topics, I'm a little bit more, I feel like, nuanced and a little bit less willing to be gung-ho with, say, the concept of open borders and just fucking whatever. I don't know how that works in a we've decided as a civilization that nation states are the way we want to govern ourselves, and so that's just what we got for now. If we ever get to one big world community and everybody, that's, fucking, I'll be gung-ho with that if it works out, but for right now, we have a nation state, so we have to address immigration. It is a real thing. And I think what frustrates me, and I do think you'll agree with this, Fowler, if there's one person I blame more than anything for this, it's less so the Democratic Party and more so Donald Trump. And the reason isn't just because of his, like you just said, the refusal of the Republican Party to address immigration. I think he's poisoned the well. I think his presence and his rhetoric back in 2016 surrounding immigration has poisoned the well to the point that the Democrats are not even willing to touch the idea of, like, okay, let's have a real discussion about immigration and what it means. Like, Donald Trump is just such a toxic individual that he's made it so the mere discussion of immigration and the border, mostly the border, that any discussion of the border, which is, like a real thing, and there are real people who, not just people who live in the United States, not just people from like Eagle Pass, Texas, but people, Hispanics coming from South America. There are real people whose lives are, um, asylum seekers whose lives are, you know, um, there are real people that suffer when these problems are not addressed. It's not just like we're just making something up out of thin air. There are real human beings who suffer when these issues are not addressed. Um,
It's
but
Trump, and I would agree that he's a huge problem, but it's also Abbott.
yes,
One of
yes,
the
yes, yes.
reasons that I'm not willing to negotiate with Abbott, and I also think that the Democrats should not take the bipartisan border bill, even if the Republicans wanted to pass it, which they don't, is Abbott, and this is maybe a disagreement that I have between me and Ardot, is I think there are real solutions to certain real problems, and I think there are fake solutions, and I'm very cynical about the fake solutions. Abbott's proposal of oh, really what I want to do is just kill every single person who isn't white who tries to cross over the Texas border. That is not a real issue.
No,
That is not a real solution. It does not fix the problem. It does not make people safer. All it is mass death. And the
I'm
reason that he
astonished.
can
I'm
propose
astonished that did not get more publicity. That he said that.
well, the problem is that is not out of line of the Republican Party. The solution to the immigration problem is simply overt racism and it's violence, and in the case of Abbott, literal state mandated murder of those that they disagree with. And I think I'm not willing to break bread with these people, and I'm not willing to give them legitimacy. I am willing to give legitimacy to immigration as a problem, but under no circumstances should the Democratic Party pretend that people like Donald Trump and Greg Abbott are proposing serious, real solutions
Yes, of
that
course
we
not.
should.
No, and
Yeah,
I think it's hard because on the flip side, the quote unquote the side that you and I are on, the Democrat side, they're not. I think the reason I'm also somewhat cynical is that I feel like, the I mean, and maybe I'm looking at this from more of a macro level, so it feels somewhat hopeless because I think the progressives most definitely, I think, have the right idea, but there's so few of them. But the sort of mainstream um, neoliberal Democratic Party is also not going to come up with solutions that are viable. So
I
it's
don't think a lot of the mainstream Democrats have a problem. They have a problem. They don't have a problem with Greg Abbott and Donald Trump because they're not solving the problem and because they're cruel and their policies lead to the deaths of innocent people fleeing violence and poverty. Their problem is that they're overt about it. Barack Obama was called the deporter in chief by Hispanic activists within the Democratic Party because he sent so many refugees and immigrants back to South America and Mexico, and his policies were also incredibly draconian. The sin for the conservative corporate Democrats of Donald Trump and Greg Abbott is not that they're monsters; it's that they're monsters who had the audacity to not hide their monstrosity behind bureaucracy and policy. The
yes,
fact that Donald Trump didn't quietly separate kids from their families, but he placed them in concentration camps and then had pictures taken of it and bragged about it. The fact that Greg Abbott won't just, use normal means to make the border, impossible to get through, but that he has the audacity to publicly say his real intentions and make a media shitstorm that makes everyone who supports those policies look bad by a lot of the spectacles he's doing at the border.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah, no, it's so yeah, it's a complex and complicated issue, and I think the I'll reiterate what I said a second ago. The political theater. I guess what makes me sad is the political theater only, it only hurts everybody. The people of Texas, the citizens of Texas who have legitimate concerns about immigration, but are being duped by a guy who, they've been duped by, a guy like Abbott who is using this as a way to stay in power because he knows that cities like Austin and Houston are starting to, lead the shift, turning Texas into a battleground state, which it was, back when Texas almost was a battleground state in 2016. And so Abbott is using this crisis to this manufactured crisis to solidify or to try to keep hold of a space that he knows without the border, like without if we fix the border, if we economically supported South America, if we did all these things, if we fixed our immigration system, added more judges to the system, more processors, all that, if we did all of this, Abbott would have nothing to campaign on because he doesn't believe in anything. The border is all he has.
Doesn't have anything to believe on it. He is fucked up massively. He privatized the Texas power grid while being heavily funded by the people he gave those contracts to. And then the grid failed and hundreds of Texans froze to death in the winter. Greg Abbott has, he has slashed benefits and welfare. Greg Abbott has,
He's destroyed Texas.
His policy has literally murdered thousands of people.
Texas is the number one. I'm a big, obviously a big climate change freak, but Texas is like leading. Like if we got like Texas is leading America in making our emissions high. Like if you look at the rate of, climate change, like emissions, it's like all Texas. Like it's not. It's like just them. Like it's just like it's the rest of the U.S. is like kind of like light pink, and then just Texas is dark red. Like they are producing like fucking a massive amount of our deadly emissions that are exacerbating climate change, which is crazy because they're one state, but they're a big state and they produce a fuck ton of oil and a fuck ton of natural gas.
There's interesting polling. And I think this has changed, where generally liberals don't hate Southerners. Like maybe there's condescension about it, but that isn't the case. Like a lot of conservatives despise liberals, and like we can see this in psychology.
Did you mean when you said Democrats hate Southerners? Do you mean Democrats hate conservatives?
Or liberals and conservatives. Okay. I didn't mean to use Southerners and Northerners. But I think this is a phenomenon that's really changed, where I think a lot of liberals are increasingly furious with conservatives. And I think a lot of liberals blame them for the rise of fascism because it is the conservatives who have propagated this. I think a lot of women blame the conservatives for destroying Roe v. Wade. I think a lot of liberals are increasingly angry and bitter about the South. And while, I grew up in the South, and I think that's like the wrong approach to it. I think a lot of that anger is understandable, and it will only become worse. And the polarization between liberals and conservatives will only become worse with figures like Donald Trump and Greg Abbott, who actively ferment these things in order to hold on to political power. But I think it's important to note, we're not making a screed against Southerners in particular. We both consider ourselves Southerners. We're angry with the fact that Southern leadership has failed this country, that people like Greg Abbott have a responsibility to handle the crises and issues in their states properly, of managing the government competently, and that they have instead, clung to power by using the worst kind of demagoguery. And you know, we we think that the progressivism that we both advocate would benefit everyone. And that's kind of why we push for a big national approach, and we try and communicate these issues in a way that we hope will reach people outside of our own respective bubbles.
Yeah, and even with that being said, I mean, where Fowler and I have had our disagreements, it's mostly based around, I think the U.S. is a big place, and I think the really cool thing about the United States is it feels like we have a bunch of different mini countries within a bigger country. Referring to America as an empire and an imperial project, and I'm saying this neutrally. I'm not making a judgment on that. I'm just saying viewing America through the lens of an empire makes a lot more historical sense. And again, I say this neutrally. Not saying that's good or bad. But I'm a very strong regional slash state advocate in large part because I think as I think it's a protectionist thing within me where like I am pro industrialization, but I also think that there is a space for an agrarian economy. Like, I think, a country as big as the US, we can grow our own food. There's no reason why Saudi Arabia has to own a fuck ton of acres in Arizona. There's no reason why Chinese corporations should own the amount of land they own in the United States. There's no reason for that. And I'll, if that makes me a piece of shit, I'll gladly fucking scream that to the rooftops. But I think you can have both. I think you can have regional differences, and those regional differences are going to lead to people having differences of opinions, but like if and that's okay, and we have to learn the goal of I think if you're a political party and you represent different facets of American life, the people out west living in Wyoming, the people down south living in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, the people up north living in Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, whatever. You still have to, we have our state differences and our regional differences, but the federal government's role is to accommodate everybody's, sort of, it's to be a regulatory force, that accommodates everybody. And, we still have to recognize each other as a united nation. And, so that's kind of, I guess, how I tend to look at things. And I think it's okay to accommodate regional differences, but you still have to have a moral, you still have to have a principled stance, and you still also have to recognize, like Fowler said, when there are real solutions, and then the solutions that are not real solutions. And the really unfortunate thing about, I think, the South is that we've produced unbelievable things, but if we don't get a handle on some of our more unsavory qualities, it's going to lead to bad things. And I think what we're seeing in Texas is a culmination of what happens when you have the worst people in power that advocate and perpetuate the worst habits.
And it's the other thing is you have to remember is when the segregationists wave black people in front of their white voters, or when people like Greg Abbott and Donald Trump wave like migrants in front of your faces, like those people are not the ones with power. They're not the ones that are bending the law to benefit themselves. They're not the ones that use dark money and lobbying to control the federal government. They're not the ones who,
have the ability to cut your Medicaid or your Medicare.
Yeah, they're not the people who really are the problem. And like they are servants of the powerful. There's a reason Donald Trump pretends to be a tough guy. Greg Abbott pretends to be a tough guy, but you don't see them cracking down on the wealthy. You don't see them redistributing the wealth and making the rich pay their taxes. You don't see them going after, in a real way, corruption within their own parties. That they're not willing to do any of that. And the reason is, while it doesn't hurt Greg Abbott and there's no possible retaliation for him killing migrants on the border, he understands that if he fucks with the powerful, if he fucks with the wealthy, if he fucks with the elites, like, he won't be governor anymore.
Yeah.
And that's something that has to be kept in mind. And if you've followed Southern history, I mean, the South has produced a lot of incredibly powerful populist progressives. Governor Jim Folsom, Big Jim Folsom from Alabama. Tom Watson before he lost his fucking mind, and all the Populist Party leadership in the 1880s and the 1870s. In the Midwest, Williams Jennings Bryan, both the Long brothers, like Jeff Davis. Like, the South has produced some of the greatest progressive figures in American history. So I don't doubt that with the right messaging and the right leadership, that like we can cast away the pretenders and have real radicalism rule the South once again. But it is definitely a difficult project, and it is going to require a lot of work of winning back Southerners who, for generations, have been lied to by the people that they trust into hating the people who
and
are
who are
not
also, in
responsive.
comparison to the rest of the United States, racketed with things like poverty and drug addiction. It's you're talking about one of especially when you go over to places like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, you're talking about the poorest parts of the United States. So it's not just about getting in good leaders; it's about fixing poverty. It's about actually, actually distributing wealth in a way that allows for people to become more economically empowered, regardless of your skin color. It's not even just a race thing. It's regardless of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also part of it as well.
Yeah, the South has a lot of environmental factors that have made its ability to industrialize and unionize significantly more difficult. Certainly.
Um, and then of course you have I think obviously the race thing somebody needs to nip that in the bud, because that is also holding back a lot of progress. I mean, there's polling to indicate that people's that people's willingness to, I mean, it was you that told me the stat, wasn't it, that Republicans will vote against welfare that they themselves receive if they know that the welfare could be going to somebody who's not white.
Yeah, that's
That's fucking crazy. Like that's that's insane. Um, so there's a lot of things that need to be nipped in the bud down here in order for us to make progress. But you just keep on keeping on, I guess. We're at an hour and 1 minute.
Damn, last podcast was long too.
Yeah. Well, we talked a lot. I talked a lot. Do you want to go ahead and sign us out since you signed us in?
Yeah, sure. This is the podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening. We will try and pick a lighter topic next week, because I feel like we've dropped two heavy ones.
Yeah, next week we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine for an hour. So next week is the Israel-Palestine special show.
I know that like the liberal or progressive news has been covering Israel and Palestine pretty nonstop. One of the reasons that like I for one, like we did one episode about it, but one of the reasons I for one have like been a little reticent about covering it is I think it's we try when we do topics to like bring in interesting opinions and to like have a different spin on things, but I think I don't know, it's very difficult to spin like 10,000 Palestinians have died now past last week. Like this many churches and hospitals have been destroyed.
Yeah, there's not really
has said more insane and evil things, and it's hard to have something to say because it's atrocious, and there's it's just such a dark and in a weird way repetitive tragedy.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I had a conversation with a friend the other day, and they were voicing their apprehension about voting for Biden, and as I was talking to them, I kind of realized, I was like, oh fuck, because they were discussing possibly voting third party, and I basically said to them, I'm like, well, the only three viable candidates right now are all pro Israel. So if that's going to be your benchmark, you're pretty much fucked. Which I, in retrospect, looking back, I'm like, that's actually really terrible. Like they're like RFK is pro, is pro Israel. Biden's pro-Israel, Trump's pro. There's no, I mean, if you're fucked whichever way you go, which is a a very difficult position to be in, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm with Fowler on that. It's a difficult topic to talk about because there really is no. I mean, you're talking about not even decade. You're talking about a century of deep, deep religious beliefs, people who are, who are really into Zionism and who have been taught Zionism, people in Israel who have been, the trauma of something like the Holocaust happening to a group of people and that group of people, the state of Israel, genuinely feeling like this is our only place we can be because we can't let something like that happen again versus the conflict with, the Palestinian people who, hey, we were also here when you came in, but fuck it. And that, there's just a lot of different factors and all of them are very dark and very difficult and it is, like what Fowler said, it's culminated all in this, 10,000 children are dead in Palestine. Yippee-dee, like, it's fucking all we can talk about because that's, doesn't seem like anybody's going to be letting up, and it doesn't seem like Netanyahu is, has learned anything from this. He's going full speed ahead with the bullshit. So, that's about all we can say about that, I guess.
We'll pick something later next week. We'll do something. We'll do a history thing.
Heck yeah.
Maybe.
But anyway, this is Week Old Beans. I'm R. Dot. That's Fowler. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video.